single dad, took a job nobody wanted as a billionaire's driver and lived the best days of his life. Jake Martinez stared at the crumpled job posting in his trembling hands. $150,000 a year to drive for a billionaire nobody dared to work for. The other men in the unemployment office whispered warnings. 3 drivers before you just disappeared. His daughter's empty lunchbox sat on the passenger seat of his beat-up Honda, a silent reminder of another dinner she'd go without. The mansion loomed ahead through his windshield, dark windows like dead eyes watching his approach. Jake's finger hovered over the doorbell, knowing that desperate men don't get to choose their devils. His parole officer's words echoed, "One more mistake, Martinez, and you're done." But what if this mistake saves us both? The fluorescent lights in the state unemployment office buzzed like angry wasps, casting a sickly yellow glow over rows of plastic chairs filled with broken dreams. Jake Martinez sat in the back corner, his calloused hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 42, he looked older. Prison had a way of aging a man from the inside out. 3 years behind bars for stealing medical supplies to pay for his wife's cancer treatments. 3 years of watching other inmates get letters from their families while his mailbox stayed empty. 3 years of knowing that when he got out, the world would see only one thing. Ex-con. The letter from his daughter's school sat folded in his jacket pocket, the words burned into his memory. Sophie Martinez has been selected for the advanced mathematics program. However, participation requires a laptop computer and additional fees totaling $800. $800 might as well have been $8 million. His last job interview had ended the moment they ran his background check. The manager's expression had shifted from cautious optimism to cold dismissal in the span of a heartbeat. "We'll be in touch," she'd said, already looking past him to the next candidate. Sophie lived with her grandmother now, had been since Jake went away. At 9 years old, she still believed her daddy was going to fix everything, still saved him drawings from school, still asked when he was coming to get her. Each visit to that cramped apartment felt like swallowing glass. His mother-in-law, Maria, tried to hide the overdue bills, but Jake saw them stacked on the kitchen counter. Utilities, rent, groceries, all the weight pressing down on an elderly woman's shoulders because her son-in-law had made choices that seemed right at the time, but felt like poison now. The job posting had been stuck behind others on the community board, as if someone had tried to hide it. The salary jumped off the page like a neon sign, but it was the whispered conversations that made Jake's blood run cold. Tommy Rodriguez, a guy Jake recognized from the neighborhood, had leaned close and said, "My cousin applied for that driving job, never came back from the interview. Police found his car abandoned downtown, but no sign of him." Others nodded with the grim certainty of people who'd learned not to trust good luck. Edmund Sterling. The name carried weight in the city, though nobody seemed to know exactly why. Some said he'd made his fortune in tech. Others whispered about government contracts and shadowy dealings. What everyone agreed on was that people who got too close to Sterling had a habit of disappearing. Not dying. That would leave evidence. Just vanishing, like they'd never existed at all. Jake had done his research at the public library, scrolling through news articles that painted Sterling as a reclusive billionaire who lived in a fortress of a mansion on the outskirts of town. No family, no friends, no social media presence, just money and mystery. Now Jake sat in his Honda outside Sterling's estate, watching the security cameras track his movement. The iron gates stood open, but somehow that felt more ominous than if they'd been locked. It was like walking into a spider's web willingly. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Sophie asked when you're coming for dinner again. I told her soon. Please don't make me a liar, mijo." The words hit harder than any judge's sentence. He looked at the job posting one more time, at that impossible salary that could change everything. Then he drove through the gates. The mansion's front door opened before Jake could knock, as if someone had been watching his approach. The man who answered wasn't what Jake had expected. Edmund Sterling looked like a retired college professor. Thin, grey-haired, wearing a cardigan that had seen better decades. His eyes, though, those were different. They held the kind of quiet intensity that made grown men uncomfortable, the gaze of someone who saw everything and forgot nothing. "Mr. Martinez," Sterling said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who didn't use it often. "You're punctual. That's encouraging." He stepped aside, gesturing Jake into a foyer that felt more like a museum than a home. The walls were lined with paintings that looked expensive and photographs that looked personal, though Jake couldn't make out the faces from where he stood. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Sterling," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. The house smelled like old books and furniture polish, with an underlying current of something else. Loneliness, maybe, or secrets kept too long. Sterling led him through hallways that seemed to stretch forever, past rooms glimpsed through partially open doors. Jake caught sight of a library with books stacked floor to ceiling, a sitting room with covered furniture, and what looked like a child's bedroom, though the bed was made with military precision and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight. Finally, they reached Sterling's office, a room dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of perfectly manicured gardens. "Sit," Sterling said, settling behind a desk that looked like it could double as a landing strip. He opened a manila folder, Jake's file, no doubt, and studied it with the methodical attention of a man dissecting a laboratory specimen. 3 years in Millfield Correctional, theft of medical supplies, wife deceased from cancer. He looked up, those sharp eyes boring into Jake's. "Tell me, Mr. Martinez, what makes a man steal medicine?" Jake's first instinct was to give the rehearsed answer, the one he'd practiced for job interviews. Instead, something about Sterling's directness made him tell the truth. Because watching someone you love die while knowing you could help them but can't afford to makes you do things you never thought you'd do. Sterling nodded slowly, as if Jake had passed some invisible test. "And what makes a man apply for a job that everyone in town says will get him killed?" "Because living isn't the same as being alive," Jake said. "And right now I'm just surviving. My daughter deserves better than that." For a long moment, Sterling said nothing, just stared out at his empty gardens. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "The position requires absolute discretion. No questions about where we go or who we meet. No discussion of my business with anyone. And I mean anyone. You'll drive me places that others might consider unusual, at times that others might find suspicious. You'll see things that might make you uncomfortable. Can you handle that?" Jake thought about Sophie's empty lunchbox, about Maria's unpaid bills, about the way other fathers looked at him when he picked Sophie up from school, when he could afford to pick her up at all. "Yes, sir. The salary is $150,000 annually, plus benefits, health insurance that covers family members, use of the staff quarters if needed, though I imagine you'll want to maintain your own residence." Sterling slid a contract across the desk. "There's one more thing, Mr. Martinez. The men who worked for me previously didn't disappear. They moved on to better opportunities I helped them find. But people prefer dramatic stories to boring truths." Jake picked up the contract, scanning terms that seemed almost too good to be true. "Why me? You could hire anyone with credentials like these." Sterling leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "Because, Mr. Martinez, I've learned that a man who steals medicine for his dying wife is the kind of man who understands what really matters. And what really matters is why I need someone I can trust completely. As Jake signed his name at the bottom of the contract, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping off a cliff. But sometimes, he thought, falling was the only way to learn if you could fly. Jake's first week working for Edmund Sterling felt like living in a waking dream where nothing made sense but everything was too good to question. The man who'd supposedly made 3 drivers disappear spent most of his time reading in his library or tending to orchids in a greenhouse that could have housed a small airplane. Their daily routine was mundane to the point of being boring: morning drives to Sterling's doctor appointments, afternoon trips to the bank, evening visits to what Sterling called community obligations. It was the evening visits that made Jake's skin crawl. The first time Sterling directed him to pull up behind a warehouse in the industrial district, Jake's hands started sweating on the steering wheel. The area was the kind of place where people minded their own business, because asking questions could get you hurt. Graffiti covered most surfaces, and the streetlights that hadn't been shot out cast sickly pools of yellow light that didn't quite reach the shadows between buildings. "Wait here," Sterling had said, climbing out of the black sedan Jake now drove instead of his beat-up Honda. "Keep the engine running." Jake watched in his rearview mirror as Sterling disappeared into the warehouse through a side door that opened before he could knock. 20 minutes later, he emerged with 3 men who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime movie: leather jackets, gold chains, and the kind of posture that suggested they were carrying more than just attitude. One of them handed Sterling a thick manila envelope. Sterling handed him something in return, something small enough to fit in a closed fist. The drive home had been silent, Sterling staring out the window while Jake's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. By the 3rd week, the pattern was clear. Mornings were normal: doctor visits, errands, the occasional trip to Sterling's lawyer's office. But as the sun set, they'd head to places that Google Maps probably didn't list as legitimate businesses. Parking garages where Sterling met with men in expensive suits who spoke in whispers and counted cash. Abandoned buildings where teenagers with haunted eyes exchanged backpacks with Sterling before disappearing into the night. Once, memorably, a cemetery where Sterling left flowers on a grave while someone Jake never saw clearly left a briefcase by a maintenance shed. Jake's conscience warred with his bank account. The first paycheck had been direct deposited exactly as promised, more money than he'd seen in one place since before Sarah got sick. He'd paid Maria's overdue rent, bought Sophie new clothes, and for the first time in years, taken her to dinner at a restaurant with cloth napkins and waiters who didn't look at him like he might steal the silverware. But late at night, lying in the studio apartment Sterling had helped him find, Jake stared at the ceiling and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. The rational part of his mind whispered that he was driving for a criminal, that the money in his account was dirty, that he was just another link in a chain that probably ended with people getting hurt. The desperate part of his mind whispered back that Sophie had smiled when he picked her up from school in a car that didn't make embarrassing noises, that Maria had cried with relief when he handed her the rent money, that for the first time since getting out of prison, he felt like maybe he could be the father his daughter deserved. The war between those voices came to a head on a Thursday night in October, when Sterling directed him to a neighborhood Jake recognized. It was the area where he'd grown up, where gangs recruited kids who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Sterling had him park outside a community center that Jake remembered from his own childhood, a place where volunteers tried to give kids alternatives to the streets, though the streets usually won. "Mr. Martinez," Sterling said, turning in his seat to face Jake directly. "I need you to come with me tonight." Jake's mouth went dry. In all their evening excursions, Sterling had never asked him to leave the car. "Sir, there's someone I want you to meet." Sterling's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Someone who might help you understand what we've been doing." Against every instinct screaming at him to drive away, Jake followed Sterling into the community center. The lobby was decorated with children's artwork and motivational posters that were trying too hard to be inspiring. The sound of voices drifted from a room down the hall, young voices, some laughing, some arguing, all of them carrying the particular edge that came from growing up too fast. Sterling led him to an office where a woman in her 50s sat behind a desk covered in grant applications and volunteer schedules. She looked up when they entered, and her face broke into a smile that transformed her from tired social worker to someone's favorite aunt. "Edmund," she said, standing to embrace Sterling like an old friend. "Right on time. The kids are excited to see you." "Hello, Carmen," Sterling replied, and Jake was startled by the warmth in his voice. "I'd like you to meet Jake Martinez, my new driver. Jake, this is Carmen Rodriguez. She runs the youth programs here." Carmen shook Jake's hand with the firm grip of someone who'd learned to command respect in a world that didn't give it freely. "Nice to meet you, Jake. Edmund's told me about you. Said you might be interested in seeing what we do here." Before Jake could ask what Sterling had told her, she was leading them down the hall toward the voices. They entered a room where about 20 teenagers sat in a circle, some on folding chairs, others on the floor. They ranged in age from maybe 14 to 18, and Jake recognized the look in their eyes, the particular mixture of hope and cynicism that came from lives that had started hard and stayed that way. "Everyone," Carmen called out, and the room quieted. "I want you to meet Mr. Sterling and Mr. Martinez." The reaction was immediate and surprising. Instead of the sullen suspicion Jake expected, several of the kids jumped up to greet Sterling with genuine enthusiasm. A girl with purple streaks in her hair hugged him like he was family. A boy with tattoos creeping up his neck from under his collar showed Sterling something on his phone with obvious pride. "Mr. S got me into that coding boot camp I told you about," the boy was saying. 6 months and I'll have my certificate. Already got a company interested in hiring me." "That's wonderful, Marcus," Sterling replied, and Jake could hear real pleasure in his voice. "You've worked hard for this." As the evening progressed, Jake began to understand. This wasn't just a youth center, it was a lifeline. Sterling wasn't just a visitor, he was a benefactor. The teenagers shared stories of educational opportunities, job training programs, and second chances that had all been funded by the man Jake had assumed was a criminal. The warehouse meetings, the midnight exchanges, the mysterious packages, they weren't drug deals or money laundering. They were Sterling connecting kids with resources, opportunities, and hope. On the drive home, Jake finally found his voice. "How long have you been doing this?" 5 years, Sterling replied, staring out at the city lights. "Since my son died." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge Jake wasn't sure he was ready to cross, but he found himself asking anyway. "What happened?" Sterling was quiet for so long that Jake thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, in a voice so soft Jake had to strain to hear it, he said, "David was 17. Brilliant boy, full of plans to change the world. He was driving home from a friend's house when a drunk driver ran a red light." Sterling's hands clenched in his lap. The man who killed my son had been arrested for drunk driving twice before. He should have been in jail, but his lawyer got him plea deals, reduced sentences. The system failed my son, Mr. Martinez, so I decided to build a better one. Jake pulled into Sterling's driveway and sat in the darkness, engine idling, trying to process everything he'd learned. The people you meet with, social workers, counselors, employers willing to give kids a second chance. The suspicious packages are laptops for students who can't afford them, work clothes for job interviews, sometimes just groceries for families who are struggling. Sterling looked at Jake directly. "I could write checks from my office, but that would be charity. What these kids need isn't charity, it's opportunity. They need to earn what they get, to feel like they're part of something instead of just recipients of something. And the secrecy? Sterling smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. Have you ever been poor, Mr. Martinez? Really poor, where every dollar matters and pride is sometimes the only thing you have left? Jake nodded. Then you understand why a 17-year-old gang member can't walk into a job interview knowing that everyone assumes he only got the chance because some rich man felt sorry for him. Better to let them think they earned it on their own merit. Sterling opened the car door, which, by the way, they did. I just made sure merit had a chance to matter. As Jake drove home to his apartment, his mind was reeling. Everything he'd assumed about Sterling, about the job, about his own moral compromises, had been wrong. He wasn't working for a criminal. He was working for someone who'd figured out how to turn grief into purpose, who'd chosen to build instead of destroy. But as he pulled into his parking space, Jake noticed a black SUV idling across the street, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. The vehicle pulled away as soon as Jake parked, but not before he caught a glimpse of the government plates. Someone else was watching Edmund Sterling. And now, Jake realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the October air, they were probably watching him too. The FBI approached Jake on a Tuesday morning while he was buying coffee at a shop 2 blocks from his apartment. Agent Sarah Chen was Asian American, maybe 35, with the kind of sharp professional demeanor that suggested she'd climbed her way up through a system that hadn't made it easy. Her partner, Agent David Walsh, was older, Irish-looking, with grey at his temples and eyes that had seen too much. "Jake Martinez?" Chen asked, sliding into the booth across from him before he could answer. Walsh took the seat beside her, effectively boxing Jake in. "We'd like to talk to you about your employer." Jake's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Edmund Sterling," Walsh said, his voice carrying a Boston accent. "We know you've been working for him for about a month now. We also know he takes you to some interesting places." Chen opened a tablet and slid it across the table. The screen showed surveillance photos. Jake's car parked outside the warehouse, outside the cemetery, outside a dozen other locations he recognized from his evening drives with Sterling. In several shots, Jake could see himself behind the wheel, face clearly visible despite the darkness. "Mr. Martinez," Chen said, her voice softer than her partner's, "we're not here to arrest you. We're here because we think you might be able to help us understand what Edmund Sterling is really doing." "I drive him places," Jake said carefully. "That's it. Places where he meets with known criminals." Walsh interjected. "Places where money and packages change hands. Places where federal agencies have lost track of fugitives who mysteriously develop new identities." Jake's stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" "We're saying," Chen replied, "that Edmund Sterling has been under federal investigation for 5 years. We believe he's running a sophisticated operation that helps criminals disappear. New identities, clean records, transportation to safe locations. We believe the 3 drivers who worked for him before you didn't quit. We believe they're living under new names somewhere far from here." The coffee in Jake's mouth tasted like ash. "And you think I'm next?" "We think," Walsh said, "that you're in a unique position to help us figure out exactly what Sterling is doing and how he's doing it. We think you might be the break we've been looking for." Chen leaned forward. "Jake, can I call you Jake? We know about your daughter. We know about the money Sterling's paying you. We're not asking you to give that up. We're just asking you to pay attention, to remember details, to help us understand whether Sterling is helping people or hurting them." "And if I say no?" The agents exchanged a look. "Then you continue driving for a man who might be one of the most dangerous criminals we've never been able to catch," Walsh said. "And when we finally bring him down, and we will bring him down, you go down with him. Conspiracy charges, racketeering, accessory to whatever crimes we can prove he's committed. You'll go back to prison, Jake. For a lot longer this time. Jake stared at the surveillance photos, at his own face captured in dozens of compromising moments. What exactly are you asking me to do? Wear a wire. Chen said simply. Record your conversations with Sterling. Document where he takes you and who he meets with. Help us build a case. And if he finds out? Then you're probably dead. Walsh said bluntly. But if you don't help us, you're probably going to prison for the rest of your life anyway. At least this way, you have a chance to protect your daughter from watching her father disappear again. They left Jake sitting in the coffee shop with a business card and 24 hours to decide. The card felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in his pocket as he drove to pick up Sterling for their afternoon appointments. How could he sit in the same car with the man, make small talk about the weather, and pretend everything was normal when FBI agents were asking him to betray the first person who'd given him a real chance since he got out of prison? But as the day wore on, Jake found himself looking at Sterling differently. The afternoon was routine. Bank, lawyer's office, stop at an upscale pharmacy where Sterling picked up a prescription. But in the evening, Sterling directed him to a new location. A rundown motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions about identification. Wait here, Sterling said, just like always. But this time, Jake watched more carefully. Sterling knocked on the door of room 17. A woman answered, mid-20s, blonde, with the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been running for a long time. She handed Sterling a grocery bag, took an envelope in return, and was back inside the room within 30 seconds. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute, but Jake had seen enough to know it wasn't about youth programs or community service. On the drive home, Sterling was quieter than usual. When they stopped at a red light, he turned to Jake and said, "You're different tonight. Something troubling you?" Jake forced himself to meet Sterling's eyes. "Just tired, I guess." Sterling studied him for a moment, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that the older man could see right through him. "It's important to be careful who you trust, Jake. In my experience, the people who seem most concerned about your welfare are often the ones planning to hurt you the most." The light turned green, and Jake drove the rest of the way to Sterling's mansion in silence, Agent Chen's business card burning like a coal in his pocket. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at Agent Chen's business card, while his coffee grew cold and his conscience waged war with itself. By dawn, he'd made his decision. Or maybe the decision had made itself. He couldn't betray Sterling, not after seeing what the man was really doing. But he couldn't ignore the FBI either, not when they held his future and Sophie's future in their hands. The wire was smaller than Jake had expected, barely the size of a shirt button. Agent Chen taped it to his chest in the back of an unmarked van, her touch clinical and impersonal. "Just act normal," she instructed. "Don't ask leading questions. Don't try to get him to confess to anything. Just let him talk. And if he finds this thing, then you're probably dead," Agent Walsh said from the front seat, not bothering to sugarcoat it. "But Sterling's smart. If he was going to kill you, he would have done it already. The fact that you're still breathing means he either trusts you or he's planning something bigger." Jake's hand shook as he drove to Sterling's mansion that morning. The wire felt like it was broadcasting his betrayal to the world, though he knew it was invisible beneath his shirt. Sterling was waiting in his usual spot by the front door, but something was different. His normally immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled, his silver hair uncombed, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as Jake had. "Good morning, Mr. Martinez," Sterling said as he settled into the back seat. His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "I have some unusual stops to make today. I hope you're prepared for that." Their first destination was a federal building downtown, specifically the FBI field office. Jake's blood turned to ice water as he pulled up to the security checkpoint. Was this it? Had Sterling figured out what Jake was doing? Was he about to be delivered to the very agents who'd recruited him? But Sterling didn't get out. Instead, he rolled down his window and spoke to the security guard. "Please tell Agent Morrison that Edmund Sterling is here to see him. He'll know why." 20 minutes later, a man in his 50s emerged from the building. He was tall, grey-haired, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He approached the car cautiously, his eyes never leaving Sterling's face. "Edmund," the man said through the window. "It's been a long time." "Hello, Jim," Sterling replied. "I think it's time we had that conversation." Agent Morrison, if that was his real name, glanced at Jake, then back at Sterling. "Your driver stays in the car." "Actually," Sterling said, turning to look directly at Jake, "I think Mr. Martinez should hear this. After all, it concerns him directly." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as Morrison reluctantly got into the front passenger seat. The wire pressed against his chest like a guilty secret, recording every word of what he was certain would be his death sentence. "You know why I'm here, Jim," Sterling began. "Your people approached my driver, Agent Chen and Agent Walsh, specifically. They want him to wear a wire, to spy on me." Morrison's poker face didn't slip, but Jake saw his jaw tighten slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Edmund." "Please." Sterling's voice carried a note of exhaustion. "We've been dancing around each other for 5 years. You think I'm running some kind of criminal enterprise, helping fugitives disappear, laundering money through my charity work, and you know what? You're not entirely wrong." Jake's world tilted sideways. The wire was recording Sterling's confession to federal crimes, and Jake was sitting right in the middle of it. "But you're not entirely right either," Sterling continued. "Yes, I help people disappear, but not criminals, Jim. Witnesses, victims, people your own system has failed to protect." Morrison leaned forward. "What are you saying?" Sterling reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. "I'm saying that for 5 years, I've been doing the job that federal witness protection should have been doing, but couldn't. When Maria Santos's testimony put her ex-husband's drug cartel behind bars, and your people couldn't guarantee her safety, who do you think gave her a new identity and a new life in Oregon? When Tommy Chen, yes, relation to your Agent Chen, refused to testify against the human trafficking ring that killed his sister because he was afraid they'd kill his daughter, who do you think made sure both of them disappeared before the trial?" Jake's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed suddenly clicked into place. The mysterious meetings, the envelopes of cash, the people who looked like they were running from something. They were running, but not from the law. They were running toward safety that the official system couldn't provide. "You've been operating an unauthorized witness protection program," Morrison said, and for the first time, his voice held something other than suspicion. "Jesus, Edmund, do you have any idea how illegal that is? Do you have any idea how many people are alive because of what I've done?" Sterling shot back. "How many children are sleeping safely in beds tonight because I gave their parents a way to testify against monsters without signing their own death warrants?" Morrison opened the folder Sterling had given him, scanning documents that Jake couldn't see but could guess at. Records, testimonies, evidence of lives saved through Sterling's shadow network. "Why now?" Morrison asked finally. "Why tell me this now?" Sterling looked at Jake in the rearview mirror, and those sharp eyes held something that might have been regret. "Because Mr. Martinez doesn't deserve to be caught in the middle of our war. Because 5 years ago, I lost my son to a system that values procedure over protection, and I decided to build something better. But I'm 68 years old, Jim. I'm tired. And I need to know that what I've built will continue after I'm gone." The silence in the car stretched until Jake thought he might scream. Finally, Morrison closed the folder and looked at Sterling. "What do you want?" "Immunity for my network. Official recognition for what we've been doing. A way to transition our operations into something that works within the system instead of around it." Sterling's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the years of carrying this burden alone. "And I want Mr. Martinez left out of it entirely. He's just a driver who needed a job. He doesn't deserve to pay for my choices." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "I need to make some calls." As Morrison got out of the car and walked back toward the federal building, Sterling turned to face Jake directly. "You can take the wire off now, Mr. Martinez. I assume Agent Chen gave you one of those little button devices. They're quite sophisticated these days." Jake's face burned with shame as he fumbled with his shirt, removing the wire with hands that shook like leaves. "You knew?" "I've known since yesterday morning," Sterling said gently. "The same way I knew that Agent Morrison would be expecting my call, that this whole elaborate dance was leading to exactly this moment." "I don't understand." Sterling smiled, and it was the saddest expression Jake had ever seen. 5 years ago, when the FBI first started investigating me, I reached out to an old friend, Jim Morrison. We served together in Vietnam, back when we were young men who thought we could save the world. I told him what I was planning to do, and he told me that if I ever got caught, he'd try to help me find a way to make it legal. Jake stared at the older man, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "This was all planned. Me getting approached by the FBI, me wearing the wire, this conversation?" "Not all of it," Sterling said. "I couldn't have planned for you, Jake. I couldn't have planned for someone who would remind me what it feels like to trust another person completely." He paused, looking out at the federal building where Morrison was presumably making those phone calls. "But yes, I've been working toward this moment for a long time. The question is, what happens next?" Jake looked at the wire in his hands, then at Sterling, then at the building where his future was being decided by people he'd never met. For the first time since he'd gotten out of prison, he felt like he had a choice that actually mattered. "What happens next?" Jake said, slipping the wire into his pocket. "Is we go help some more kids who need a second chance." Sterling's smile this time wasn't sad at all. 6 months later, Jake Martinez stood in the lobby of the newly christened Sterling Foundation for Second Chances, watching his daughter Sophie help other children log into the computers that had been donated by tech companies across the city. The foundation's official partnership with federal law enforcement had been announced 3 months ago, amid a media storm that painted Sterling as either a vigilante hero or a dangerous rogue, depending on which news channel you watched. Jake didn't care about the media attention. He cared about the fact that Sophie now attended a private school on a full scholarship, that she lived with him in a 2-bedroom apartment that he could actually afford, and that when she asked him what he did for work, he could tell her the truth. He helped people who needed help. Sterling had been granted immunity in exchange for turning over his entire network to federal oversight. The Sterling Protocol was now being studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as a model for protecting witnesses who fell through the cracks of traditional programs. 3 congressional hearings and a Justice Department review later, Sterling's methods were being quietly adopted by agencies that had spent 5 years trying to shut him down. "Dad," Sophie called out, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Sterling wants to talk to you." Jake found Sterling in his office, which looked remarkably similar to the one in his mansion, complete with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city. The main difference was the photographs on his desk. Not just the picture of his son David that had always been there, but new ones. Photos from the Foundation's graduation ceremonies, pictures of former gang members receiving job training certificates, snapshots of families who'd been given second chances and made the most of them. The Peterson family made it safely to their new home in Montana, Sterling said without preamble. Mrs. Peterson starts her new job as a bank teller next week. The kids are enrolled in school under their new names. Jake nodded. The Petersons had been the Foundation's first official case under the new federal partnership, a family whose testimony against a domestic terrorism cell had put them in mortal danger. 6 weeks ago, they'd been living in fear, afraid to leave their house. Now they were building a new life in a place where no one knew their history. Agent Morrison called this morning. Sterling continued. The Justice Department wants to expand the Sterling Protocol to 12 more cities. They're asking if I'd be willing to train their people. That's good news, isn't it? Sterling was quiet for a moment, staring out at the city skyline. Do you ever wonder, Jake, if we're really making a difference? Or if we're just putting band-aids on problems too big to solve? Jake thought about the question. About the teenagers in Carmen Rodriguez's youth center who now had job training and college scholarships, about families like the Petersons who could sleep without fear, about his own daughter who was growing up believing that her father was someone worth being proud of. I think, Jake said finally, that every person who gets a second chance is a victory. And maybe if we have enough small victories, they add up to something bigger. Sterling smiled and picked up the photograph of David from his desk. He would have been 22 this year. I used to imagine what he might have become, doctor, lawyer, maybe even president. Now I think about all the young people we've helped, and I wonder if maybe this is what he would have wanted. Maybe this is his legacy. Jake left Sterling's office and walked back into the main area of the Foundation, where Sophie was now showing a group of younger children how to use a drawing program on the computers. She looked up when she saw him and waved, her face bright with the kind of joy that came from feeling useful, from being part of something important. As Jake waved back, he thought about the night he'd sat in his car outside Sterling's mansion, desperate enough to take a job that everyone said would get him killed. He'd been looking for money then, for a way to survive. Instead, he'd found something he hadn't even known he was missing. Purpose. The job nobody wanted had given him everything he'd never dared to hope for. Sometimes, Jake reflected, the most dangerous thing you can do is trust someone to see past who you've been to who you might become. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that trust transforms not just your life, but the lives of everyone around you. Sophie called his name again, excited to show him something new she'd learned. Jake Martinez, former convict, former desperate man, current deputy director of the Sterling Foundation for Second Chances, walked over to see what his daughter had created. Outside, the city continued its ancient rhythm of breaking and healing, of people falling down and getting back up, of second chances blooming in the most unlikely places. And in a small office building where hope had been converted into policy and grief had been transformed into purpose, a little girl taught other children how to draw their dreams on screens that glowed like promises in the afternoon light.